You know that moment when you pull into your driveway and immediately wonder if you took a wrong turn into the Pentagon parking lot? Well, that's exactly what happened to me, only replace Pentagon with my own property and replace security agents with a determined woman holding a smartphone like it was a weapon of mass instruction. She stood there, arms fully extended, platinum hair whipping in the wind, broadcasting my arrival like a breaking news story. If drama were currency, this lady could single-handedly pay off the national debt. Memory below. If you had the sheer audacity to show up on your own property, what would your neighborhood's reaction be? "Sir, you're not on the authorized list," she shrieked, making sure her voice hit every note between righteous indignation and outright panic. For a second, I half expected black helicopters to circle overhead and men in dark sunglasses to jump out from behind the mesquite bushes. Instead, there was just her, Diana Lockhart, the newly crowned HOA president of Cedar Hollow Preserve, wearing an expensive beige power suit that probably cost more than my first car. She held her phone at a cinematic angle, narrating into it dramatically. "Suspicious individual attempting to breach security perimeter. Please share widely for community safety." I calmly pointed to the metal sign clearly marking my ownership. Bennett Ranch, established 2021. It wasn't flashy, sure, but it did have the inconvenient advantage of being undeniably true. Diana, however, didn't miss a beat. Logic, apparently, wasn't part of her homeowner association bylaws. Ignoring the obvious, she doubled down with gusto. "That rusty old sign means nothing. This area falls under HOA jurisdiction." Her voice was confident, sharp, like a surgeon declaring a Band-Aid illegal. I raised an eyebrow considering the irony of being accused of trespassing on my own property. It was like being handed a speeding ticket for jogging too fast on your treadmill. This wasn't exactly how I'd planned to start my weekend. As a federal judge specializing in corporate fraud, my days were usually filled with suits and handcuffs instead of suits with smartphones. I'd bought this quiet ranch 3 years ago after losing my wife Sarah to cancer. It was supposed to be my sanctuary from courtrooms filled with greed and deception. A simple place where my rescue dog Max and I could unwind without complications. The old cedar-sided ranch house wasn't glamorous, but it had character. Something Diana Lockhart might struggle to appreciate, unless it came with a price tag and mandatory approval forms. I watched Diana spin dramatically toward her audience, still narrating my security threat status with all the breathless excitement of a CNN correspondent reporting live from a hurricane. That's when I realized. Sometimes the universe throws you a curveball, and sometimes it throws a whole parade. Smiling inwardly, I leaned casually against my truck, waiting patiently. She clearly expected me to shout or argue, but experience had taught me something valuable. Never interrupt an opponent when they're making a mistake, and Diana Lockhart was shaping up to be my favorite mistake of the year. Deputy Kyle Jennings arrived in a plume of desert dust, looking less like the cavalry and more like a guy who just remembered he left his lunch at home. Kyle was a decent enough officer, but handling HOA theatrics clearly wasn't his specialty. Sort of like asking a master chef to critique microwave dinners. He glanced apologetically at me, then turned to Diana Lockhart, who immediately launched into her performance of victimhood, detailing my alleged crimes with a theatrical flourish worthy of Broadway. I had to admit, it was impressive how Diana managed to blend truth and fiction into a smoothie of absolute nonsense. "Officer, this man became belligerent when I simply tried to explain our community protocols. I feared for my safety," she exclaimed, her voice quivering dramatically, though she stood 20 feet away and hadn't stopped filming me once. Keeping my voice measured, I calmly reached into my truck and produced the property deed, driver's license, and a freshly printed property survey documents, clearer than a spring morning in New Mexico. Kyle studied them quietly, his face shifting from polite boredom to mild confusion, and then finally to embarrassment. "Mr. Bennett, everything here checks out. You're definitely on your own land, bought and paid for fair and square," Kyle said, handing back the papers with a look that silently apologized for the wasted time. Diana, though, wasn't ready to abandon her show so easily. Her eyes flashed, narrowing into what I imagined was her corporate takeover glare, the one reserved for boardroom meetings or baristas who forgot almond milk in her latte. She puffed up confidently, resembling an overinflated balloon ready to burst. and began another volley of objections, ignoring reality as easily as some folks ignore their morning alarms. "This isn't about property lines, it's about community standards," she declared triumphantly, pivoting so fast I half expected her to get whiplash. "And you, Mr. Bennett, clearly have no respect for either. Do you even know who my husband is? He holds municipal contracts with half the city departments." The last part was delivered with the conviction of someone who'd watched too many mafia movies. She clearly thought mentioning her husband's contracts would make me tremble and fold faster than a cheap poker hand. Unfortunately for her, I'd spent decades dealing with far scarier threats from people who could actually back them up. But her little slip did catch my attention, and it settled quietly in the back of my mind, like an unexpected clue at a crime scene. Municipal contracts? Interesting. "Well, Ms. Lockhart," I replied calmly, "if you truly believe I'm violating HOA standards, feel free to submit your grievances through official channels. You seem to enjoy paperwork." I couldn't resist smiling slightly at the way her eyes twitched at the suggestion. Diana was clearly the kind of person who enjoyed imposing forms and rules on others, but hated them when they applied to herself. It was a common trait among corporate executives I'd prosecuted over the years. The louder their outrage, the shakier their foundation. Diana's authority was like a sandcastle built too close to the tide, impressive at first glance, but destined to collapse spectacularly under scrutiny. She glared at me, sensing perhaps that her bluff had been called, but still determined to maintain her illusion of control. "Don't think your calm demeanor intimidates me," Diana snapped, her voice pitched theatrically high for the benefit of her still-running live stream. "I've handled far tougher cases than some guy who thinks watching courtroom dramas on TV makes him a legal expert." I raised an eyebrow slightly at that one. If only she knew. It was amusing to think that she saw me as just another amateur armchair lawyer, someone who learned law from binge-watching reruns of Law and Order. In reality, her ignorance was my greatest advantage. But I kept quiet. After all, there's a reason they call it holding your cards close to your chest, and I intended to play mine very deliberately. Kyle Jennings sighed deeply, clearly exhausted from this performance of neighborhood theater. "Ma'am, filing a false report isn't exactly encouraged," he reminded her mildly, his tone professional but weary. Diana responded by dramatically waving her phone at him. "Oh, trust me, officer, every moment is documented for the protection of our community." She spoke as though expecting applause, unaware of the irony that she was actually recording evidence against herself. Diana might have been skilled at orchestrating corporate meetings and intimidating neighbors, but navigating actual consequences seemed as foreign to her as humility to a politician. Watching her, I felt almost grateful. After years prosecuting complex fraud schemes, it was refreshing to encounter someone whose arrogance made my job straightforward. She was practically handing me the tools to dismantle her power trip, neatly packaged with a ribbon of her own hubris. As Kyle returned to his patrol car, Diana shot me a glare that promised this wasn't over. It was the kind of glare reserved for supermarket cashiers who dared question expired coupons. But behind her mask of defiance, something flickered. A momentary hesitation, perhaps the dawning realization that she might be stepping into deeper waters than she'd anticipated. She stormed back toward her BMW, heels kicking up dust, angrily murmuring into her phone. This isn't the end of this, and for once, she was right. I had a strong suspicion this was just the beginning, especially given the intriguing slip about those municipal contracts. How deep did Diana's network of inflated influence really go? More importantly, who else was entangled in her web of self-important manipulation? I decided then, with a quiet smile, that it might be worth finding out. After all, uncovering hidden corruption was my specialty, and it looked like Diana Lockhart had just invited me into her world, whether she realized it yet or not. Sometimes the loudest voices hide the weakest arguments. Diana Lockhart's inflated confidence showed me clearly how arrogance often masks vulnerability and insecurity. The truth rarely needs theatrics. It stands calmly on its own. Real authority doesn't shout or threaten. It speaks quietly, backed by evidence and integrity. The meaningful takeaway here is simple yet powerful. Stay calm when others create chaos. By holding back, listening carefully, and observing closely, we give others the chance to reveal who they truly are, often handing us exactly what we need to achieve justice without lifting a finger. After all, wisdom doesn't have to roar, it only needs to stand firm. I quickly discovered that there's a fine line between community standards and bureaucratic harassment. A line Diana Lockhart clearly enjoyed tap dancing on every single day. My mailbox became her favorite target, stuffed daily with violation notices crafted with creativity worthy of a novelist. Native buffalo grass I'd nurtured for years, suddenly deemed invasive botanical species, as though my lawn were a scene from an alien invasion movie. My rescue dog Max, whose occasional barking at passing coyotes was once charming, was now officially accused of acoustic terrorism. Honestly, it was like receiving fan mail from the IRS, annoying, endless, and expensive if ignored. And truth be told, my patience, typically sturdy as a well-built fence, was beginning to lean dangerously. Eventually, I started taping the notices to my kitchen wall, creating an art installation titled Portrait of HOA Absurdity. At first, it was amusing, a quirky exhibit that visitors would chuckle at, shaking their heads at the ridiculousness. But soon, it felt less like satire and more like evidence at a crime scene. The sheer volume of paperwork began to resemble something you'd find in the lair of a conspiracy theorist, complete with red string and thumbtacks. It occurred to me then that Diana wasn't just annoying, she was methodical. Her paperwork assault wasn't random, it was as strategic as a chess player carefully cornering her opponent, hoping to exhaust my patience and drain my resources. It was a dangerous game, and it made me wonder, if she was playing this hard with me, what was she doing to my less resilient neighbors? Curiosity led me to start digging into the HOA's financial records. Something I admit felt oddly thrilling, like unraveling a corporate mystery in my own backyard. The documents painted a disturbing picture. I quickly realized the Cedar Hollow Preserve HOA wasn't just about maintaining fences and landscaping standards. It was essentially a financial pipeline funneling money directly into the pockets of certain approved vendors, many of which were suspiciously tied to Diana's husband. Landscaping violations, acoustic consultations, environmental compliance fees. The paperwork was dense enough to make my courtroom fraud cases look like children's bedtime stories. I joked quietly to myself, calling their financial structure a piggy bank disguised as governance. But beneath the humor was a deeper concern. This scheme was systematic, purposeful, and ruthlessly efficient. Determined to uncover the human side of this bureaucratic nightmare, I visited some neighbors, quietly and discreetly, the way you'd approach someone who's endured trauma. First was Mrs. Eveline Harris, an elderly woman whose wind chimes once brightened her porch but were now labeled acoustic violations. Her trembling voice described how the HOA had fined her relentlessly, forcing her into a loan just to pay off the mounting penalties. It felt surreal watching her describe something so innocent as wind chimes as if they were contraband smuggled goods. Another neighbor, George Whitaker, a retired veteran, revealed how Diana's regime forced him to replace his garden plants multiple times, each iteration costing thousands of dollars, and required by so-called approved specialists. It was heartbreaking, yet strangely enlightening to realize these violations weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a well-oiled machine designed to push elderly residents into financial corners. Suddenly, my quirky wall of violation notices felt less like an annoyance and more like evidence in a much larger investigation. Then came the revelation that stopped me cold. I discovered the previous owners of my ranch, Henry and Louise Carter, had lost their beloved home through foreclosure due to a similar barrage of HOA fines, just like the ones taped across my kitchen wall. Digging deeper, I learned their story mirrored Evelyn's and George's: escalating charges for trivial offenses, fines that spiraled out of control, and finally foreclosure when their savings dried up. Henry had been a retired school teacher, Louise a librarian. People who dedicated their lives to quietly nurturing communities, only to have their dreams crushed by manufactured debt. It dawned on me in that quiet moment, staring at their story laid out coldly in bank records, that the house I'd purchased as my peaceful retreat was actually a silent witness to their tragedy. It wasn't just about fighting for my own sanity anymore. It had become about uncovering justice for all who'd been silenced before. Walking back into my kitchen later that evening, staring at the ridiculous wall of notices, I felt a strange resolve settle over me. It was ironic, in a way, that Diana's relentless attacks were exactly what had forced me to look deeper, to truly see what was hidden beneath layers of legal jargon and phony compliance. Diana, in her arrogance, had handed me the blueprint to her corruption, neatly packaged in bureaucratic red tape. It reminded me of courtroom cases I'd prosecuted, where defendants unwittingly provided the exact evidence that sealed their fate. And here, in my retirement haven, I was once again facing a case worthy of federal scrutiny. With a sense of purpose reignited, I resolved that Diana Lockhart would soon find out what happens when you push someone who knows exactly how to push back. But first, I had questions. And plenty of them. Who else had fallen victim to Diana's financial ambushes? How deep did the corruption really run? And most importantly, was Diana merely a puppet, or was someone else pulling her strings? These were the threads I planned to unravel, one bureaucratic notice at a time. Behind every stack of meaningless paperwork lies a deeper story. Diana's flood of ridiculous notices taught me something valuable. Injustice often hides in plain sight, masked by bureaucracy and legalese. It's easy to dismiss small irritations as mere annoyances, but looking closer can reveal deliberate strategies meant to exploit the vulnerable. This experience reminded me that patience and curiosity can uncover truth, even in the smallest details. What began as absurd paperwork became evidence of a systematic scheme targeting those least able to defend themselves. It showed me clearly how important it is to stand up not only for ourselves but for those who might not have the strength or resources to fight back. Ultimately, the real lesson here is simple yet powerful. Never underestimate the importance of paying attention. Often, the greatest injustices hide behind the most mundane facades, and it's our willingness to look deeper that brings hidden wrongs into the light. If you've never been summoned to an HOA disciplinary hearing, imagine a criminal trial. Only replace the solemn judges with your nosiest neighbors and the charges with violations as serious as unauthorized bird feeders or a mailbox that's aggressively beige. Diana Lockhart had elevated this humble community meeting into something resembling the Salem witch trials, complete with ceremonial severity and theatrical drama. Walking into the Cedar Hollow Community Center that evening, I half expected someone to yell, "Order in the court!" while banging a plastic gavel from a kid's playset. Diana, true to form, sat confidently behind a makeshift bench with her board members arranged like obedient jurors, ready to dispense justice, or at least their version of it. I took my seat, watching Diana shuffle a large folder ominously labeled Bennett, Disciplinary Action. She adjusted her designer reading glasses, which I guessed were more about style than vision, and began reading a list of my supposed transgressions. Each violation was delivered with gravity typically reserved for actual crimes: unauthorized botanical cultivation, my grass; acoustic disturbances, my dog Max barking at nature; and visual pollution due to the ranch's rustic architectural style. It was as if my entire existence had suddenly become offensive. Listening to Diana describe my peaceful ranch like it was the headquarters of a crime syndicate was surreal. It reminded me of certain corporate fraud trials where defendants invent elaborate narratives to deflect blame. Only this time, the roles felt humorously reversed. Patiently, I presented a carefully prepared property survey, a professionally executed document proving definitively that my ranch complied entirely with county regulations, state law, and basic common sense. I handed it calmly across the table, expecting reason to prevail. Instead, Diana stood dramatically, took the survey, and with a flourish that belonged in a soap opera finale, ripped it right down the center. She didn't just dismiss reality, she shredded it, metaphorically and literally, right in front of witnesses. This, she announced with exaggerated authority, waving the two halves in the air, is unofficial documentation, unapproved by this HOA board. For a moment, the room was silent, and I genuinely wondered if applause or gasps were expected next, because clearly, Diana had rehearsed this moment in front of her mirror. At this point, a rational person might argue loudly or protest passionately, but years in federal courtrooms taught me that true authority doesn't need volume. Facts whisper louder than hysteria screams. So instead, I leaned forward slightly, adopting the calm, questioning tone I often used when defendants were painting themselves into corners. "Miss Lockhart," I said mildly, "just out of curiosity, what exactly gives this board the authority to dismiss a professionally prepared, state-recognized survey? Are there credentials in paperwork destruction I'm not aware of?" The subtle laughter around the room was like a gentle ripple through water, a quiet but undeniable signal of shifting tides. Diana's eyes narrowed dangerously. Clearly, she'd anticipated anger or compliance, not calm, pointed questions, delivered with courtroom politeness. But Diana Lockhart wasn't the type to back down gracefully. Instead, she stood straighter, her voice sharpening with arrogant certainty. "Mr. Bennett, this isn't democracy, it's compliance management. The board decides what's acceptable evidence." The phrase hung in the air like a billboard flashing the words "power grab," and in that instant her entire system became crystal clear. She wasn't interested in fairness or rules or even community improvement. Diana's leadership style was like running a courtroom where she played judge, jury, and executioner simultaneously, only justice wasn't invited to participate. Inside, I was smiling. Her arrogance had just given me exactly what I needed. Diana had inadvertently offered undeniable proof of her authoritarianism, neatly wrapped with a bow labeled "abuse of power." The only question now was how spectacularly her carefully crafted empire would collapse, and just how satisfying it would be to watch. This encounter taught me something profound. Authority without accountability quickly becomes tyranny. Diana's display of arrogance, dismissing facts simply because they didn't fit her narrative, reminded me that true leadership is built on respect and honesty, not power trips and theatrics. Her actions underscored how easily unchecked power can twist good intentions into harmful outcomes. But here's the real question. What happens when unchecked arrogance finally meets accountability? Stay with me, because in the next part you'll see how Diana's own tactics begin to unravel, revealing secrets she never expected to surface. Trust me, you won't want to miss this. You know, organizing community meetings isn't exactly my idea of an exciting Saturday afternoon, but sometimes justice requires trading your weekend hammock for folding chairs and stale coffee. And that's exactly how Cedar Hollow's community center looked. Folding chairs arranged in hopeful semicircles, refreshments set out as though this were a PTA gathering instead of the opening scene in a quiet rebellion. My invitation had been carefully worded, something gently reassuring. Important HOA financial information. As bait, it was irresistible, especially for someone like Diana Lockhart, whose appetite for control matched her thirst for overpriced designer beverages. Sure enough, Diana arrived right on cue, impeccably dressed in a suit whose price tag could have covered a small car payment. She strode in confidently, carrying a cup of coffee that was probably handcrafted by someone with a degree in philosophy. Diana's expression was triumphant, clearly expecting to witness my public surrender, or at least a humiliating breakdown. She even took a prominent seat up front, radiating an air of victory, like a conqueror about to address a defeated city. Ironically, her very presence energized me, similar to how a prosecutor feels when a key witness strolls obliviously into the courtroom. As the room filled, I glanced around, appreciating the tangible hum of anticipation. A crowd expecting drama, unaware that reality was about to upstage fiction. I began gently, clicking on my laptop and projecting financial documents onto a makeshift screen. Diana watched patiently at first, sipping from her designer cup, wearing the mildly amused expression of someone watching a toddler attempting algebra. Then came my casual introduction. For those who might not know, my name is Samuel T. Bennett. I'm a federal judge specializing in corruption and fraud investigations. The reaction was immediate and wonderfully dramatic, like announcing you're secretly Batman at a dinner party. Diana's designer coffee slipped from her fingers, hitting the linoleum floor with a sound remarkably symbolic, shattering her confidence along with her carefully maintained facade. Her eyes widened, disbelief quickly giving way to panic as murmurs rippled through the room. It was exactly the moment of poetic justice I'd quietly anticipated, perfectly suited for framing, if only metaphorical moments could be hung on walls. I calmly continued, methodically displaying financial statements, contracts, and suspiciously inflated vendor fees. I pointed out how elderly residents were systematically targeted, fined for trivial offenses, and ultimately pressured into selling their homes at a fraction of their worth to companies closely tied to Diana's husband. Ask yourselves, I said gently but firmly, who exactly profits from your fear? Who gains when you're too scared to question these sudden new regulations? Rhetorical questions, sure, but effective nonetheless. Faces around the room shifted from curiosity to realization, then to growing anger, each expression validating the truth being unveiled. Diana attempted damage control, sputtering protests, her voice carrying the shrill desperation of someone trying to put toothpaste back into the tube. The harder she argued, the clearer the truth became. Her empire built on fear was crumbling right before her eyes. Finally, with the grace of someone entirely accustomed to courtrooms and the gentle precision of a surgeon revealing something delicate, I projected records showing my own ranch's tragic history. I shared Henry and Louise Carter's heartbreaking story, a retired teacher and a librarian whose modest dream had been systematically dismantled through deliberate financial harassment. Exactly the same tactics now being used against others. I bought my ranch not realizing it stood on someone else's broken dreams, I said quietly, my voice steady but emotionally resonant. The Carters lost their home because someone decided their lives, their rights didn't matter as much as profit. The room was silent, a collective realization dawning that what had appeared as simple administrative annoyance was actually deliberate, calculated exploitation. Diana's frantic expression was that of a gambler whose bluff had been decisively called, and as she stood, half-forming denials that no longer had power, I saw desperation cross her face, promising retaliation as clear as daybreak after a storm. In that moment, I knew this wasn't the end, it was just the spark lighting the fuse. The real explosion, I realized with quiet anticipation, was yet to come. This part taught me that truth, when presented with clarity and courage, can shatter even the most carefully constructed facades. Diana's confident control unraveled the moment real accountability stepped into the room. It reminded me that transparency isn't just a buzzword, it's a powerful weapon against corruption. The meaningful takeaway? Justice often begins with someone daring to speak up and share what others only whisper about. When communities unite around truth, fear loses its grip, and change becomes inevitable. It's a lesson in the power of courage, clarity, and the undeniable force of collective awareness. But the real question is, what happens when those desperate to hold power start fighting back with more than words? Stick around, because next, you'll see how Diana's unraveling triggers a showdown that no one saw coming. It's where justice stops waiting and starts acting, and believe me, you'll want to witness every twist. Remember, exposing truth is just the first step. Standing firm when the battle turns personal is where real courage shows up. When Diana Lockhart realized the noose was tightening, she didn't sulk quietly in the shadows. No, she held a press conference, a masterclass in desperate image management that could have been titled "Rearranging Deck Chairs on the Sinking Titanic." Standing on the manicured lawn of the Cedar Hollow Golf Club house, she painted herself as the poor, beleaguered victim of a powerful federal judge's bullying. Her voice carried the perfect blend of wounded innocence and righteous indignation, the kind that makes you wonder if she's auditioning for a soap opera or a courtroom drama. As cameras rolled, she insisted that she was simply maintaining community standards and that I was abusing my position to intimidate her. The irony was delicious. Here she was, the architect of a small-town reign of terror, suddenly the victim of judicial overreach. But Diana's public relations campaign was more tragicomedy than triumph. Just days after her theatrical declarations of victimhood, she took her desperation to a whole new level, vandalizing my truck. Yes, in broad daylight, on my own property, she methodically dented the hood, smashed headlights and shattered windows. Each strike caught crystal clear on my security cameras. Watching the footage felt like watching a slow-motion car crash that you couldn't look away from. The woman who once wielded HOA power like a scepter was now swinging a tire iron like a disgruntled cartoon villain. Yet even as the glass shattered around her feet, she kept up the victim narrative, claiming retaliation against judicial harassment. It was like watching a toddler throw a tantrum, then cry foul when told to clean up the mess. Deputy Kyle Jennings arrived promptly, finding Diana standing amidst the wreckage, dust-covered and still clutching her weapon of choice, but remarkably undeterred. She continued to claim victim status with the kind of earnestness that defies logic. Meanwhile, Kyle, having witnessed her previous theatrics, was less than impressed. The security footage I showed him sealed the deal. There was no confusing who was the aggressor. The absurdity of it all was not lost on me. Here was the woman who had tried to control a community through fear and fines, now caught on camera dismantling a man's property, all while playing the innocent victim. If life had a sense of humor, this was its punchline. The trial that followed was equal parts spectacle and justice. Diana, representing herself after her lawyer wisely withdrew, flailed through her defense like a contestant desperately trying to remember their lines on live TV. Meanwhile, the prosecution laid out a methodical, airtight case. Videos of the truck destruction played alongside chilling testimonies from elderly residents who recounted how Diana's relentless fines and harassment turned their peaceful lives into nightmares. One woman's words still echo. She called my peace disorder and my memories violations. It was a poetic summation of how deeply Diana's actions had violated the very fabric of this community. The jury didn't need long. Her guilt was as clear as the smashed glass on my truck. Justice arrived not with fanfare but with the satisfying snap of truth prevailing. Diana was sentenced to jail time, ordered to pay restitution, and banned from ever holding HOA office again. A fitting end to her reign. The HOA itself dissolved under the weight of its own corruption, replaced by a simple neighborhood association focused on rebuilding trust instead of crushing dissent. The formerly empty homes began filling again, laughter returned to front porches, and Max's barking was no longer labeled a crime. But just as the dust settled, I spotted a new face surveying my property line, a woman with the same sharp eyes and platinum hair. Victoria Lockhart Sterling, Diana's sister, had arrived, ready to continue the family business. And with that, I realized the war might be over, but the battle against HOA absurdity was far from finished. Stay tuned, because in every story of justice, there's always another chapter waiting to be written. As I stood there watching Victoria Lockhart Sterling approach my fence with that same confident stride, I realized something important. This story isn't just about one battle or one tyrant. It's about vigilance, resilience, and the courage to stand up when systems try to silence you. What I faced in Cedar Hollow was a reminder that justice isn't handed down. It's fought for, piece by piece, day by day, and sometimes the smallest voices can topple the biggest empires. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. Never underestimate the power of standing your ground, of seeking the truth, and of uniting with your community against injustice. These lessons aren't just for me. They're for all of us navigating a world where power can too often be abused. If this story spoke to you, hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapters where more truths come to light and justice keeps marching forward. Because every story like this deserves to be heard, and sometimes it's the stories that change us all. Now it's your turn. What part of this saga do you want me to dive into next? Should we explore more HOA horror stories, unpack a legendary court battle, or spotlight another underdog victory? Drop your ideas in the comments or head over to the community tab if you're on desktop and let me know what you'd like to see. Your feedback shapes every episode, so speak up and let's make the next one even better. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss a moment of justice served with a side of irony.